Very welcome to everyone to this important event and discussion about R2P, the principle R2P, about justice and Magnitsky laws. For me, it's a real honor to have so high level of panel of experts in this discussion. I would like to extend my greeting, first of all, to all the ambassadors to Canada from Grupo de Lima and Latin America and the Caribbean, ambassador from Venezuela around the world, our colleagues, member of the Canadian and Venezuelan Parliament, Global Affairs Canada, the diaspora, of course, of Venezuela, the media that today is with us, and of course, I would like to extend our very welcome to our president, Juan Guaidó Marquez, and the panel of experts that we are going to have today. Very briefly, we are going to have Vanessa Neumann. Vanessa Neumann is our ambassador in the United Kingdom, is an expert in geopolitics, drugs and trafficking, terrorism, and financial crimes. Irving Kotler.
Encountering them, not doing them.
and counting. Irving Kotler, which is a legend alive. Irving Kotler is a former Minister of Justice, Attorney General, and member of the Parliament of Canada, lawyer and advocate of or R2P, International Justice and Magnitsky Law, legal advisor of Mandela, and one of the most prestigious actor and activist in human rights all over the world. Delsa Solórzano, lawyer, member of the Venezuelan Parliament, president of the Commission for Justice and Peace, professor in criminal law, defender of human rights. William Brodler, investor, philanthropic, whose lawyer was Sergei Magnitsky, advocate of Magnitsky law in USA, Canada, and Europe, anti-corruption leader in Global Integrity Awards. And finally, last but not least, Mr. Jared Genser, recently appointed by Luis Almagro as a special advisor on R2P to OAS. Professor, lawyer, human rights activist, previous International Legal Counsel of Hebel, Tudu, and Whistle. So welcome everyone to that interesting event. And right away, not to wait more, please, señor presidente Juan Guaidó Márquez, tiene usted la palabra para darle, digamos, apertura a este importante evento.
Muchas gracias a nuestro querido embajador Orlando Viera Blanco, a los embajadores presentes, diputados de la Asamblea Nacional, distinguidos, invitados, doctor Irving Kotler, Jared Genser y todos los invitados. Primero, agradecer este importante foro, lo que se ha convertido de visibilizar la crisis venezolana sin buscar alternativas de solución al conflicto. Hoy hablo en nombre de esos venezolanos de nuestro país que se mantienen en resistencia, se mantienen luchando en contra de una dictadura brutal y cruel que persigue, que ha encarcelado arbitrariamente, que amenaza, que asesina, con políticas simplemente de pensar distinto, que ha dejado morir por negligencia criminal a venezolanos por la pandemia o simplemente por escasez. Hoy, como ustedes saben, una dictadura que usurpó el poder legítimo del Ejecutivo, pero también de la Asamblea Nacional, que utiliza controles de todo tipo simplemente para perseguir, porque se encuentran minorías, que la rechazan más del 90% de esos venezolanos que hoy en este momento están protestando y exigiendo en las calles de Venezuela, no solamente por reivindicaciones condiciones salariales. En el caso de los maestros hoy, son más de 67 puntos a nivel nacional, pero también por enseñar con dignidad a nuestros hijos. Esta usurpación ha llevado a la persecución de los partidos políticos, de los partidos políticos venezolanos, que han sido, y de los políticos, por supuesto, que han sido encarcelados, entre otras cosas. Estamos atravesando la mayor crisis económica en la historia reciente, no solamente a nivel de hiperinflación, no solamente a nivel de contracción del Producto Interno Bruto, pero también de lo que significa hoy el poder adquisitivo del venezolano. Para que tengan una idea, a pesar de que sé que lo saben, pero es importante cada vez que podamos hacer la denuncia, hoy estos maestros que están protestando en la calle ganan $2 al mes, no al día. 1.90 diario según la ONU, ya es fecha extrema. Hoy ganan $2 al mes. La inflación ha sido del 20.000% en 2019 y se espera que suba a más del 15.000% más este año. 5 millones de venezolanos se encuentran hoy en situación de refugio. 5 millones de venezolanos se encuentran hoy en las calles de la mayoría del mundo, la segunda más amplia del mundo, comparada solamente con Siria, con la gran diferencia de que no se produce por una guerra, no se produce por un desastre natural que sufrimos. Los venezolanos salen forzadamente de nuestro país porque la escasez pone en peligro sus vidas, porque no hay oportunidades, porque ganan $2 al mes, porque nuestro país se ha convertido en uno de los más inseguros del mundo. A esto que estoy narrando estamos enfrentados y la mayoría del país no solamente resiste, sino avanza con mucha fuerza. Lamentablemente ni siquiera hay cifra oficial de desempleo en este momento en Venezuela. El Programa Mundial de Alimentación determinó en un estudio realizado recientemente que 9.3 millones de venezolanos están en inseguridad alimentaria y que se necesita asistencia, poniendo a Venezuela como uno de los países en riesgo de hambruna. Con el Congo, con Sudán del Sur, que va a ser uno de los países más ricos del mundo, con la mayor cantidad de recursos naturales, que hoy también devastan, que hoy también destruyen en el llamado arco minero. Importante hacer la mención en este foro, lo que significa que una extensión de 111.000 kilómetros cuadrados, o 111.843 para ser preciso, hoy que reposan las reservas minerales más importantes del país. Hay presencia de la disidencia de la FARC, del ELN, incluso de Hezbollah, con lo cual hoy la dictadura de grupos irregulares han entregado la soberanía. Que, por cierto, todo esto que tiene que ver con el arco minero no fue recogido aún por lo que es el Fact-Finding Mission de la ONU. La escasez de gasolina, la última maniobra del régimen para tratar de organizar un fraude y usurpar el Parlamento. Este escenario que yo les narro no forma parte de una película de terror, no forma parte de un libreto, de alguna serie oscura que pretende alguna medio de comunicación. Es lo que están pasando hoy los venezolanos. Y aquí quiero hablar de la violación de derechos humanos, que de acuerdo al informe de la Oficina de Determinación de Hechos de la Comisión de Derechos Humanos de la ONU, son catalogados como crímenes de lesa humanidad. Y está alcanzado a varios niveles como política de Estado, ejecuciones extrajudiciales, detenciones arbitrarias, tortura, datos crueles y, por supuesto, inhumanos. Importante detenernos en algunos de los detalles del informe de la Misión de Determinación de Hechos. Este se centró en los patrones de conducta en los que se produjeron las 4 violaciones de los derechos humanos previas en el mandato. La misión trató no solamente de establecer y verificar los incidentes e investigar las violaciones de derechos humanos y los delitos previstos en el mandato, sino también de identificar a los responsables de estas violaciones y delitos. Desde allí se determinó y se señaló principalmente a Nicolás Maduro como el responsable y a varios niveles militares, en pleno conocimiento y por ende son responsables de estas violaciones de derechos humanos. Un elemento de la crisis venezolana que es un factor motivador de estas violaciones, por cierto, es la corrupción. Retroalimenta la corrupción, el sostenimiento de la dictadura, cómo incentiva en este proceso, y por eso es tan importante hoy hacer uso y explotar al máximo las herramientas que hoy tiene el mundo libre para enfrentar esta dictadura. Por un lado, las sanciones a violadores de derechos humanos y corruptos, pero también explorar a fondo lo que tiene que ver con la Carta Interamericana de los Derechos Humanos, el Tratado Interamericano, y por supuesto responsabilidad de proteger. Aquí la gran pregunta, la gran reflexión en hoy, una dinámica internacional, debemos decir es que en un momento en que en un país creciente en su momento, con grandes reservas naturales, una democracia pujante en su momento, como hoy está un dictador actuante señalado directamente como violador de derechos humanos. La primera vez, por cierto, en la historia de América que eso sucede. Un dictador actuante está en funciones mientras viola derechos humanos. Esto debe llamar la atención de la comunidad internacional. Aquí el primer reconocimiento a la sociedad venezolana, que ha resistido a esta tragedia, que ha resistido a esta situación, que se mantiene en pie de lucha, luchando por su dignidad y por supuesto por sus derechos, presentando alternativas de solución al conflicto, entendiendo la necesidad de una transición. Pero también hoy sabemos de la interdependencia creciente de un mundo hoy, por supuesto, globalizado. Y lo vemos a través de la pandemia. Lo vemos cómo ha afectado claramente la sociedad global, la economía, pero también los derechos fundamentales en sociedades que tienen regímenes autoritarios. Y en ese marco yo creo que debemos nosotros tener muy clara la responsabilidad internacional, y aunque un Estado sea soberano, se debe a su población. Y en su caso, que esto no se cumple por omisión, negligencia o actuación directa del Estado, esa expresión pierde su razón de ser. Hay que leer la alerta temprana, que no se repitan las fallas de la comunidad internacional como en Sudán, en la ex Yugoslavia. Y aquí me disculpan la desviación profesional. Aquí ya no estamos hablando de mantenimiento preventivo, ¿no? Como diríamos en ingeniería industrial. Tampoco es correctivo ni siquiera. Aquí estamos viendo claramente la destrucción del Estado de Derecho. Venezuela hoy sufre las condiciones de un país en guerra, haciendo referencia a la migración, a los servicios, pero también a la situación económica del país, sus refugiados, sus migrantes, el dolor que deja la lejanía, la pérdida del hogar como centro, en este caso, de la sociedad. Nosotros vamos a seguir avanzando. Aquí de nuevo cabe, sin duda, la reflexión de estas herramientas, cómo utilizarlas al servicio de la democracia y las sociedades libres, de los países que luchan, y que no seamos simplemente relatores o espectadores de la tragedia, que no seamos simplemente relatores o escritores de una crisis en curso, sino por el contrario, busquemos todas las alternativas para solucionar, tomar acción por la dignidad humana, tomar acción por la democracia y la libertad, para poder no solamente interpretar los deseos de toda una sociedad como la venezolana, pero también global, en busca de democracia y libertad, y poder emplear a fondo herramientas que existen, que han sido diseñadas y que hoy sin duda están puestas a prueba cuando una sociedad que resiste, que exige cambios, que sigue ofreciendo alternativas de solución y que está pidiendo el respaldo y el acompañamiento en este momento de la comunidad internacional. Muchísimas gracias por la iniciativa de este foro a nuestros queridos embajadores, a nuestro embajador Orlando Vidal Blanco, a nuestros promotores en Venezuela de lo que ha sido la Comisión de Justicia y Paz, y por supuesto toda la insistencia y el acompañamiento que hemos recibido de nuestros aliados en el mundo. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, presidente, por sus palabras y por sus importantes reflexiones sobre R2P, donde ciertamente usted ha tocado temas muy importantes. Quiero simplemente destacar que no podemos ser simplemente espectadores de lo que está ocurriendo en el mundo, sino que tenemos que ser, como diríamos, creativos y más participantes en el proceso de buscar desenlaces para nuestro país. So now we are going to start with the panelists that we have as a guest today. For me, it's a real honor and he knows how much Venezuela really recognize the support and recognize the I don't have words how to explain what means Irving Kotler to Venezuelan people. So for me, it's a real pleasure. It's a real honor to start this discussion with Mr. Kotler. Mr. Kotler, very welcome, and please, the stage is yours.
Sir, and I want to commend you for initiating this important and timely international panel, and I'm delighted as well to do what the Canadian government has already done long ago, and that is to both recognize and affirm the democratic leadership of Juan Guaido, and I'm delighted that he has been with us and to provide his exemplary leadership on this panel. What I'd like to do is just outline within the framework of the subject matter of this panel what I would call an international justice agenda. For reasons of time, I will just effectively enumerate it. I won't be able to elaborate on it, but this is an informed group for whom no elaboration is really necessary. Number one, this has to do with an initiative re the International Criminal Court. As we know, some 2.5 years ago, the Organization of American States independent panel of legal experts, of which I was privileged to be one, reported that there were reasonable grounds to believe that 7 major crimes against humanity were being committed in Venezuela, which included state-orchestrated humanitarian suffering, the weaponization of food and medicine, which led to drastic humanitarian suffering and consequences. Some months thereafter, Canada led a group of both Latin American and European countries in making the first ever collective referral to the International Criminal Court of a state party, Venezuela. Regrettably, to date, the ICC has not yet opened any investigation or prospective prosecution. I believe that the 7 countries that then initiated that collective referral should reaffirm this, even get other countries on board to combat the culture of impunity and utilize the ICC for that purpose. Number 2, we need to initiate a procedure and process under the International Court of Justice for the horrific acts of torture that have been committed in Venezuela. Here too, Venezuela is a state party to the Torture Convention. Such a process can and should be initiated. A process has recently been initiated in that regard, as we know, with regard to the Gambia, Myanmar. Another one is now being initiated by the Netherlands, Syria. There should be one with regard to the horrific cases of torture, which Justice Manuel Robles Ventura of our OAS panel said were the worst cases of torture that he had witnessed in any conflict anywhere. Number 3, utilize the procedure and process for universal jurisdiction to initiate prosecutions in our respective countries where fugitive criminals from Venezuela may, in fact, ensconce themselves. They should not enjoy impunity, and we should be initiating such prosecutions. Number 4, the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights has established a partnership with the Global Accountability Initiative headed by Professor David Crane for a specific Venezuelan accountability initiative. This will involve evidence-based metrics of prosecutorial remedies that will underpin the aforementioned remedies, whether they be before the ICC or the ICJ or universal jurisdiction. Number 5, we need to utilize the UN Special Remedies and Special Procedures Initiative. Let me mention one, the UN Working Group on the Disappeared. We've had reports, and particularly this past June, of the expansion of disappeared in Venezuela. And here too, we need to hold Venezuelans officials responsible in that criminality to account. This too was one of the crimes against humanity we identified in our OAS report, but that has been expanded. And I might mention here that the UN Commission on Human Rights just 1 month ago itself reaffirmed that crimes against humanity were being committed in Venezuela, and the disappeared is one of the most egregious of those crimes. Number 6, we need to enhance Magnitsky sanctions and here to secure justice for the victims and accountability for the human rights violators. As the father, the global father of Magnitsky sanctions is on this panel, I'll leave it to Bill Browder to continue, but he is the one who inspired us, and one of the first countries that Canada imposed Magnitsky sanctions upon were the first human rights violators were from Venezuela. Number 7, the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights has partnered with the Parliamentarians for Global Action to initiate an emergency parliamentary response rapid deployment group to protect parliamentarians and human rights defenders under imminent harm, and to help build a parliamentary initiative in that regard. Number 8, and in that regard, we should establish an inter-parliamentary alliance with respect to Venezuela, similarly to an interparliamentary alliance that we've established with regard to China. We already have 23 democracies and parliamentarians from those democracies in that alliance. We should be doing the same thing with regard to Venezuela and hold hearings in our respective jurisdictions. Canada held hearings before our Foreign Affairs Committee, particularly with regard to R2P, and that too would be another initiative. Number 9, and moving to a close, we should initiate before the UN Security Council, under the auspices of the ARIA formula, named after Diego Aria, who was former president of the UN Security and presider of the UN Security Council, an inquiry that in fact could also serve the causes of justice and accountability. And finally, we need to not only enhance humanitarian relief and assistance that is desperately needed, but we need to provide a safe harbor for Venezuelan refugees in our respective countries, and utilize our refugee laws and immigration laws for that purpose. The last initiative I will leave to the world expert on that, and that is the manner in which R2P can be used to underpin the whole process of securing justice and accountability in Venezuela. We have the world's leading expert on that, Jared Genzer, who will be speaking on this panel. So I'll close now. These then are the initiatives that I believe can be taken within a framework of securing justice and accountability for Venezuela.
You have been so accurate as always. I just wanted to remark that yesterday, just to let you know, has been created a group of parliament from Canada that looking to join international parliamentary to proceed and to moving on in the direction that you already suggest in your list. So that happened yesterday, and we are very proud because we are talking about conservative, liberals, independent in Canada, join with Venezuelan parliamentarian and all parliamentarian around the world, which is going to be, of course, a good tool in order to keep running with the struggle of recovery of freedom and against human right violation. So now is for me another honor and a real pleasure to give the word to Vanessa Neumann. Vanessa is a very well-known international advisor. She's a warrior, and she has a huge responsibility right now in United Kingdom. So please, Vanessa, go ahead, and we are all your stage.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I really feel unworthy to follow Erwin Kotler, and under no circumstance did I think that I would precede my friend, well, who I'm proud, obviously very proud to call my friend Bill Browder, who's a hero of mine and whose book Red Notice, by the way, everybody should buy always. And I think a movie's being made of it, but is one of my favorite books of all time, and a big inspiration. So I feel a huge responsibility indeed for being on this panel. and to the fight for Venezuela's democracy. I don't want to step on anybody's toes. I under no way will step into sort of the expertise on R2P or the expertise on Magnitsky or the ICC, because all of that is, there are better people than I to opine on that on this panel. What I will, however, is offer somewhat of a personal and Venezuelan perspective on the issues at hand. And then I look to the better experts than I to make very specific suggestions based on their experience on what to do about it. I do have a background in I started life as a political philosopher, and I used to teach political philosophy, and basically, and concerning specifically the authorization for international intervention is actually what I wrote my doctoral dissertation on. When is international intervention justified in a country's internal affairs? So it touched upon R2P, which at the time which was, I hate to say it, the mid-90s, late 90s, when I was working on my doctoral dissertation, was quite in vogue. It has now slightly not quite recovered the popularity it had then. But I think that Venezuela is I'm sorry to say, is a bit of a house of horrors in terms of human rights abuses and kleptocracy. It has become a byword for kleptocracy and corruption and human rights abuses. And I want to speak directly to that. There are two tranches I want to take. One is the ability to pierce so-called state sovereignty in the Weimar Republic, in the Weimar conception of state sovereignty, one that is justified, which was the topic of my dissertation, and then also, and how it applies to legal things that we're doing today, specifically here in London, to do with the gold case, which everybody likes to talk about. And then also, but I want to be careful about it and just frame it in this theoretical issues that the broader discussions that we're having today, and also to talk about the links between corruption and human rights. Basically, I'll take the second part first. The link between corruption and human rights in Venezuela flows both ways. So as you saw in paragraph 116 of the fact-finding mission's report of the human rights, it specifically cites that a lot of witness statements state that a lot of the torture was specifically conducted to protect national assets, or to protect and maintain their ability to conduct corruption, so that they can continue to basically extort the country, to basically dissuade whistleblowers. These are all things that Mr. Browder is the world expert on, to dissuade whistleblowers, to continue to maintain access, to dissuade journalists or anybody who would threaten the power or the ability, the positioning of the Maduro regime to continue to steal money from the Venezuelan people and continue to engage in kleptocracy, in corruption. We have corruption and kleptocracy of every variety. And when I was in Caracas in 2017 and interviewing a number of people, some people even allied with the Maduro regime made it very clear to me. I said, when will you leave power? And they said, when we steal the last dollar from Venezuela, that's when we will leave. So they were very clear in 2017, and that is very clearly what they are trying to do now, to literally basically leave the Venezuelan people without a present and without a future. And they continue that the tortures are particularly linked for them to stay into power and to continue to steal and corrupt. The other thing, the other direction of the links between corruption and human rights abuses in Venezuela is that the massive kleptocracy, which is of a scale the world has never seen. We estimate that somewhere between $300 and $450 billion has been stolen from Venezuela, either directly stolen or money laundered, or through the Cadivi, preferential exchange rate. That is money that has not gone to the Venezuelan people, has been stolen. And because of that, we have things like a collapsed healthcare system, a collapsed infrastructure, a collapsed electrical grid. And these things, when the electrical grid fails, or the water isn't pumped, or the food doesn't arrive, causes further deaths. So the deaths are to keep the corruption going, and the corruption has caused the deaths and are causing the massive humanitarian crisis. And it is unfortunate, It is heartbreaking to me that my homeland, the country where I was born, and for which I have dedicated a couple of decades of fight, it still has become a byword for corruption, human rights abuses, and the biggest humanitarian crisis in the Western Hemisphere has ever seen, and the biggest refugee crisis, second only to Syria. But if Maduro stays in power, we will surely surpass Syria. So that's the first bit I wanted to make about the links between human rights abuses and kleptocracy and corruption, that it goes both ways. The second, to go back to the prior point I wanted to make, emphasize about national sovereignty. So the concept of sovereignty has been, even since the era when R2P became in vogue in the early 90s, is conditional. And I'm on record. I mean, I've published a book on the subject. Is conditional upon the state serving the well-being of its people. A government is there to serve its people, to defend its interests, to advance its interests, and to defend its rights. That is the purpose of government. And that is what forms the basis of the nexus between citizen rights and obligations. When that government fails for one of two reasons, which is either autonomy or legitimacy, there are two concepts, and Venezuela fails on both. Then you have the legal basis, the moral basis, and the legal basis to intervene for foreign intervention. Let me parse them out. Legitimacy is that the people want you in power, that the people voted you in, that you have, that they speak for you, that the people have said, I want these guys in power. As we know, the reason why the Guaidó administration is in is because Maduro stole the election in 2018. This is not an ex post facto invention. This is the fact that in 2018, more than 60 countries did not recognize the election. It did not by any way meet the standard. And it is because of that we now have, for instance, the legal challenge that we have an interim president, a constitutional, that the UK has admitted as an interim constitutional president of Venezuela, whose mission is to get the people to speak for our democracy again, to get us to free and fair elections and end the dictatorship. That is the mission of the Guaidó administration, to which I and many others on this, have signed on. And that is because of the lack of legitimacy of Maduro. That's the first part. The second part is autonomy. So the other way that a government is supposed to serve its people and maintain, some argument about the fact that you can't pierce the veil of, that if you're in the presidential palace, people can't intervene, is autonomy. The Maduro and the Chavista regime have made the Venezuelan people kneel to foreign masters. They are kneeling to foreign masters in Iran, in Russia, in Cuba. And they have become puppets for transnational criminal organizations. They have sold out the interests of the people in order for them to just stay there and continue to serve these masters. And I know that this is a concept, again, that the other three international experts on this panel understand very well. And they cannot, so they have sold out the autonomy, and they have also sold out autonomy in their ability to maintain order. There is no order. They cannot satisfy the basic needs of the people. They cannot, in terms of food, water, electricity, they cannot, they cannot control. They've sold out vast parts of the territory to transnational criminal organizations and NSADs, non-state armed actors, some of them foreign terrorist organizations. So the Maduro regime fails to have a viable defense against international intervention of the R2P variety, because it fails on both the legitimacy standard and the autonomy standard. And it functions solely as a cartel to basically stay there to continue kleptocracy. And the human rights abuses are linked in both directions with the kleptocracy. They are a cause of the kleptocracy, and the kleptocracy is a cause of the human rights abuses. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to take questions and build on those comments if anything was unclear.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. So Wow, you go directly to the point. It is just a couple of points that I want to remark as well. First, it's a very important issue, the how so close crime against humanity is in relation to the link with corruption. So that is important because when you're talking about no intervention, when you're talking about legitimate inherency in a country, and when you try to defend yourself as a state, the state must be represented by legitimate government, which means government in sense of justice and protection of the people, not against the people. So that is a real challenge of R2P. How we can justify in the future the principle of non-intervention when you are facing a state of criminality and a state of organized crime. So thank you very much for your very precise and accurate intervention, Vanessa. So now, just to continue warming up here, it's my honor as well and my pleasure to introduce Mr. Bill Browder. Bill Browder, that we already mentioned, he advocates for Magnitsky sanction. It's a huge mission. He's a philanthropic investor, but in any case, he's one of the main defenders of human rights around the world. So, Mr. Bill Browder, thank you for coming today and to participate in this discussion. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be here with President Guaido, with my good friends, Erwin Kotler, Vanessa Neumann, Jared Genter. And I'm looking forward to sharing a few thoughts about getting the bad guys in Venezuela. I have a lot of experience with bad guys in Russia. For those of you who don't know me, I was an investor in Russia in the 1990s and 2000s. I started to expose corruption in the Putin regime, and as a result, I was expelled from the country. My offices were raided. My lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, was arrested. He was tortured for 358 days, and he was murdered in November 2009, more than 11 years ago. Since then, I've been on a mission to get justice and facing the same type of questions that you're asking yourself today, which is when you have a criminal regime, and Vanessa, your point is a very good one, which is that human rights and kleptocracy are completely intermingled. But when you have a criminal regime, like you do in Russia, like you do in Venezuela, like there are in a number of other places, what do you do? And Erwin laid out a checklist of actions that need to be taken, starting with the International Criminal Court, the UN, et cetera. And all those actions are great if one can get them moving. But one thing, it's one thing to run a case at the International Criminal Court, which can take decades. And it's another thing to get justice today. And the idea that we came up with after Sergei Magnitsky's murder was that the people who killed him for money. And the people who get that money don't keep that money in Russia, just like the crooks in the Maduro regime don't keep their money in Venezuela. They keep their money in New York, in London. They buy properties in the south of France and in Spain. And they send their kids to boarding school in Switzerland and in England. And those people we can target by freezing their ability to spend their money in the West and to stop them from traveling to the West. And it may not sound like such a terrible consequence for somebody who's committed torture and murder, but it's better than no consequence at all. And that became the concept behind the Magnitsky Act. And I took this idea originally to Washington, and I shared it with a Democratic senator from Maryland, Benjamin Cardin, and a Republican senator from Arizona, the late John McCain. And I said, can we ban the visas and freeze the assets of the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky? And they said yes. And that became known as the Magnitsky Act. Originally, when I first proposed it, it was just a piece of legislation for Sergei Magnitsky. But after they put it onto the law books, their phones started ringing. And all these other victims in Russia said, you found the Achilles heel of the Putin regime. Can you sanction the people who killed my husband, my brother, my sister, my aunt? And after about a dozen of these calls, these two senators said, wait a second, we're onto something much bigger than just one case. And they added 65 words to the law to sanction all gross human rights abusers in Russia. It went for a vote in the Senate. It passed 92-4. It passed the House of Representatives with 89%. And it became a federal law in the United States on December 14, 2012. And Putin went out of his mind. Vladimir Putin, in retaliation, banned the adoption of Russian orphans by American families. And these were orphans that were often sick and crippled and sometimes wouldn't survive if they hadn't been adopted. So Putin was effectively sentencing some of his orphans to death in retaliation to the Magnitsky Act. He then made it his single largest foreign policy priority to repeal the Magnitsky Act and stop it from spreading. So when these senators saw this, instead of being intimidated by any of his actions, they said, wait a second, if Putin is responding this way, there sure are a lot of other dictators, kleptocrats, who deserve the same treatment. And so they introduced the Global Magnitsky Act. And in 2016, the Global Magnitsky Act passed. And the Global Magnitsky Act takes those same sanctions, visa bans and asset freezes, and applies them to torturers and murderers and kleptocrats anywhere in the world. Now, following the United States passage of the Magnitsky Act, I've been working for a decade with Erwin Kotler here on this call, who is a superhero in the world of human rights. And we got Canada to unanimously pass the Canadian Global Magnitsky Act in both houses of parliament. And a week after they passed the Global Magnitsky Act, all of Magnitsky's, or not all of them, but most of Magnitsky's killers were sanctioned. But also on the first list were a bunch of crooks from the Maduro regime. It was the first sanctions list and included Venezuelan officials. Since the United States and Canada, we have Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Kosovo, who all have Magnitsky Acts. The British Parliament passed the Magnitsky Act in 2018 and implemented it in July of this year. And probably the biggest milestone is coming up soon, which is the EU. The EU just distributed the text of an EU Magnitsky Act to all member states yesterday. And rumor has it that it should be in place and ready to go by December. Now, the EU Magnitsky Act is not ideal. It doesn't include kleptocracy like the US and Canada, and we're working on that. Nor does the UK Magnitsky Act include kleptocracy, and we're working on that. And the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, promised me that they would make an amendment and to include kleptocracy. So we have a tool. It's a tool that has already been applied to Venezuela and can be applied further. I'm very happy that the Magnitsky Act addresses, at least scratches the surface of the terrible injustices that the Venezuelan people have suffered from these crooks who have taken over the country illegally. And I think going forward that Venezuela will be continue to be one of the countries that gets more people sanctioned in all of these jurisdictions. And I'll certainly do whatever I can to support your cause in my conversations with these governments around the world, because I can't think of a more extreme situation than the one you're facing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Browder. So we have an important point here. The only way to try to stop the escalation of the crime around the world is with the escalation of the rule of law. And that's represent Magnitsky Act. Try to put more sanction in order to try to isolate this kind of crime and mafias around the world. So thank you very much for your intervention, and again for your important role in this struggle. So now we are going to proceed with one of the Venezuelan lawyer and woman that, as I'm saying, it is a proof of the dignity, strength, and determination of the Venezuelan woman. I'm saying that here we have two women, Vanessa and Delsa Solórzano. That is a proof of determination, strength, and dignity of the Venezuelan woman. I decide never to have a discuss against Vanessa or a discuss with Delsa Solórzano, but it's going to be our next speaker in this important event. So, querida Delsa Solórzano, bienvenida a este webinar y el stage es todo tuyo. Adelante, por favor.
Muchísimas gracias a los organizadores, a nuestro querido embajador de Venezuela en Canadá, Orlando Viera, y pues por supuesto a todos los panelistas que comparten con nosotros este espacio donde no pretendemos abordar nada distinto que la necesidad de libertad de nuestro país. I going to speak in Spanish. Cuando en 1948 se dicta la Declaración Universal de Derechos Humanos, como consecuencia, por supuesto, de la Segunda Guerra Mundial y con el único objetivo de proteger a los pueblos de los desmanes de los gobiernos, en efecto, la Unión de Países Democráticos pretendía que nunca más el mundo viera horrores como los que se habían visto en el marco, pues, de la Segunda Guerra Mundial. Lamentablemente, de algún modo, todo ello quedó desvirtuado cuando algunos miembros de la comunidad internacional comenzaron, tal vez hasta sin pensarlo, en ser cómplices de gobiernos que violaban derechos humanos. Comienzo por aquí porque en efecto nosotros en Venezuela de alguna manera hemos sufrido todo esto a lo largo de estas 2 décadas. Hoy, felizmente en nuestro país, aun cuando no hemos alcanzado la libertad, contamos con un presidente legítimo, interino, el presidente Juan Guaidó, que es un hombre que tiene plena conciencia de la necesidad no solamente de proteger derechos humanos, cuando nos corresponda, pues finalmente, el ejercicio del gobierno, sino de acompañar todo lo que tiene que ver con las denuncias relativas a lo largo de más de 2 décadas, por lo que ocurre es desde tiempo reciente hacia nuestras denuncias. Yo siento que de alguna manera cuando la cumbre de jefes de Estado y de gobierno en 2005 en la ONU señala pues la necesidad de la responsabilidad de proteger, es tal vez porque se dieron cuenta de que no se estaba haciendo suficiente. Y en el caso de mi país, de nuestra Venezuela, ya ni siquiera hablamos de violación de derechos humanos, que obviamente es de suyo suficientemente grave, sino que estamos hablando hoy día de crímenes de lesa humanidad. Crímenes que tienen que ver directamente con la situación que estamos viviendo hoy en mi país. Hoy en mi país nosotros no hablamos del informe de la misión de verificación de hechos como un tema del pasado, como tal vez hoy leemos el informe del Nunca Más elaborado por la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos en el caso de la dictadura argentina y la vemos como un doloroso pasado. Hoy no es esa la realidad de Venezuela, sino que por el contrario es nuestro presente. Mientras nosotros estamos en este evento, hay más de 400 prisioneros de conciencia, Todos ellos están siendo brutalmente torturados en este momento, a esta hora, mientras nosotros conversamos, 13 de la tarde en Venezuela, hay torturados en mi país. En este momento, en mi país, hay prisioneros políticos. En este momento, hay decenas de venezolanos manifestándose en las calles porque en pleno siglo XXI, un país como Venezuela no tiene agua, no tiene energía eléctrica, no tiene gas doméstico. Y la respuesta del régimen usurpador es la represión, es la prisión política, es la persecución. Eso lo estamos viendo de manera constante. Asimismo vemos cómo están persiguiendo, por ejemplo, a las familias de los embajadores que han sido designados por el presidente Guaidó o de cualquier ciudadano que decide asumir un cargo de designación por la Asamblea Nacional o por parte del gobierno interino. Con lo cual incluso estamos viendo que se está volviendo a prácticas atávicas dignas de la Inquisición, donde se persigue a las familias para poder tratar de atrapar a quien en efecto quieren encarcelar. Ese es el régimen de Nicolás Maduro: tortura, tratos crueles, inhumanos o degradantes, prisión y desaparición forzosa, asesinatos. Son muchos los venezolanos asesinados en el marco de esta terrible tragedia, no solamente en el marco de manifestaciones, sino prisioneros políticos que han perdido la vida en manos de funcionarios del régimen. Pero además, como no les son suficientes los funcionarios uniformados, el régimen se vale también de ciudadanos o grupos terroristas autodenominados colectivos que complementan la acción de represión que ejercen los uniformados del Estado. Hoy finalmente vemos el informe de la misión de verificación de hechos del Consejo de Derechos Humanos de la ONU y creo que tiene mucho que ver con lo que señalaban quienes me antecedieron en el derecho de palabra. Y me refiero específicamente a la motivación que lleva a los dictadores, a los criminales, a cometer estos hechos en mi país. Y se refiere a la corrupción. Cuando en el informe de misión de verificación de hechos se investiga cuál es la motivación para cometer los crímenes de lesa humanidad, la respuesta que dan los testigos, y quiero destacar que la misión entrevistó a funcionarios uniformados tanto activos como retirados, y todos coincidieron en que su principal motivación era justamente la corrupción, seguir enriqueciéndose de manera ilícita y seguir saqueando los recursos del Estado venezolano. En diversas entrevistas que nosotros pudimos tener con la misión, sabemos de la seriedad con la que este informe se hizo. Pero en todo este marco, donde hoy en Venezuela no se garantiza ningún derecho, por el contrario, se violan todos los derechos humanos al mismo tiempo. En un marco además en el cual la comisión de crímenes de lesa humanidad se ha convertido en un hecho prácticamente cotidiano y donde todos nosotros podemos ser víctimas de este tipo de represión en cualquier momento. De hecho, el propio Parlamento ya lo señalaba el presidente Guaidó al inicio de este evento, ha sido cercado, tomado militarmente. Somos 139 parlamentarios sometidos a algún tipo de acoso o de persecución. Incluso todavía hay parlamentarios presos, como por ejemplo el diputado Juan Requesens. En este marco cobra más vida la necesidad de proteger a los venezolanos. Cuando nosotros hablamos de la responsabilidad de proteger, es evidente que tenemos la obligación de referirnos a lo que fue acordado en la ONU en el año 2005, porque se habla de la responsabilidad de proteger basado en 3 pilares fundamentales. La responsabilidad de cada estado de proteger a sus poblaciones. Evidentemente ese primer pilar aquí no se está cumpliendo porque es el propio estado quien violenta nuestros derechos humanos y quien comete crímenes de lesa humanidad en nuestra contra, pero también está la responsabilidad de la comunidad internacional de ayudar a los estados a proteger a su población, y es ese el segundo pilar. Y el tercero, que es la responsabilidad de la comunidad internacional de proteger a las poblaciones de un estado cuando éste evidentemente no solamente no logra hacerlo, sino cuando es éste quien comete los crímenes. Y eso es lo que está ocurriendo hoy en Venezuela. Cuando los ciudadanos de mi país salen huyendo de la nación y se van sin nada, con la ropa que tienen puesta, caminando hacia cualquier otro país, en nuestro caso, Brasil o Colombia. Es porque están huyendo de alguien que los puede asesinar. Sí, el régimen de Nicolás Maduro puede asesinar a cualquier venezolano. No en vano, quienes hoy pierden la vida por la inexistencia, yo no digo precariedad, digo inexistencia de un sistema de salud en nuestra nación. Ellos son víctimas también de estos crímenes de lesa humanidad que hoy se cometen en mi nación. Nosotros, en las fuerzas democráticas, en la alternativa democrática, somos muy conscientes de nuestra responsabilidad. Ya lo decía también el presidente al inicio de su intervención. En la Asamblea hemos creado incluso la Comisión Especial de Justicia y Paz, que tengo el honor de presidir, para establecer todos los mecanismos, incluso relativos a la transición, que van desde leyes, justicia transicional, justicia ordinaria durante la transición, resarcimiento a las víctimas, procesos de reconciliación, etcétera. Pero es menester que entendamos que no podemos solos. Dando por la libertad, pero evidentemente enfrentamos a un régimen que está fundamentando sus bases en el ejercicio de la violencia, en el ejercicio absoluto del poder que se refleja en armas, y que estas armas son empuñadas contra una población civil que hoy ha decidido cambiar, pero que el régimen no se lo permite. Es por ello que nosotros estamos convencidos que juntos, tanto a lo interno como al externo, presión interna y presión externa, es lo único que va a lograr la libertad de mi país. Es pues claro que el mundo democrático, que Occidente en particular, que todos los que creemos en la libertad y en la democracia, que todo aquel que esté en su país pensando, por ejemplo, en qué negocio puede hacer con el régimen de Nicolás Maduro, debe saber en primer término que cualquier dinero que reciba del régimen de Maduro está manchado con la sangre de los venezolanos. Pero además se debe saber que los venezolanos necesitamos apoyo internacional y necesitamos evidentemente toda la ayuda que sea posible para lograr nuestra libertad, nuestra democracia, y para ponerle fin a un horror, a un terrible horror que en pleno siglo XXI, que en pleno 2020 nadie pensó que podía vivir Occidente, y muchísimo menos un país como Venezuela. Quedamos, pues, por supuesto, dispuestos a responder todas las preguntas que bien tengan. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you. Muchas gracias, Elsa. Thank you very much for your intervention. Listen, it's no exaggeration. It's not an exaggeration to say that in Venezuela we have a genocide in slow motion. As the President Juan Guaido had said at the beginning, even though it's not a war, it's worse. Because on a statistic basis, the statistic in Venezuela about starving regarding criminality, impunity, is just primitive. It's unprecedented. So if any one of you can read the conclusion of the Summit 2005 in relation with R2P, one of the conclusions is that when you have an undefended people in a state that had been taken, kidnapped by the tyranny, it's an obligation of the state to intervene and protect. And that's the case of the Venezuelan people. It's amazing how our deputies in Venezuela just stay there confronting and facing so many risks. It's true, just this week, the last week, many of us, many of the ambassadors have been attacked and intimidated by the regime. And as long as we cannot have justice, impunity prevails. And that's one important issue of Mr. Irving Kotler in order to impose. It's important to impose a formal investigation in the International Criminal Court by the countries who had done already a referral. But again, justice is the only way to try to stop these situations. Thank you, Delsa, for your very good explanation. And you live it every day in Venezuela. So now, last, as I'm saying, but not least, I would like to introduce Mr. Jer Jenser. Jer Jenser had been just recently appointed by Luis Almagro as a special commissioner to R2P. So for sure, Mr. Jenser has so many things to try to reflect today with us. Thank you very much for your time. Maybe it's your first, it's gonna be your debut as a commissioner in any kind of webinar. So we are very proud and very happy that you decide to accompany today in this event. Please go ahead, the stage is yours.
Well, thank you so much. And it's great to be on such a distinguished panel with President Guaido, Vanessa and Delsa, longtime collaborator Bill Browder, and friend and mentor Erwin Kotler, and of course Orlando. Thanks for hosting this also. I am actually very pleased to be with you all here today in my new capacity, where I'm giving my first public remarks as the special advisor on the responsibility to protect the Organization of American States. I was honored to be appointed to this position by Secretary General Luis Almagro, and I will speak briefly about my mandate and then more specifically about the kind of work I will be undertaking in that context on the situation in Venezuela specifically. It's worth observing at the outset that my appointment to this position is in fact historic. I'm now the first special advisor on R2P for any regional organization in the world. Though to be clear, other regional organizations such as the African Union, ECOWAS, and OSCE have begun discussing and or applying R2P in practice. Yet, although R2P was adopted by the UN in 2005, all four of the UN special advisors on R2P, going back to Ed Luck at the beginning, have spoken about the importance of R2P being taken up by regional organizations. So, for example, the current UN special advisor on R2P, Karen Smith, said in August 2020, quote, "It is important to emphasize the vital role that regional responses, including those centered around regional and sub-regional organizations, can play in preventing and responding to atrocity crimes. These should not necessarily be seen as supplanting global efforts, but the advantages, including that regional organizations are often better placed to take early action, are well known and should be encouraged." As noted in the press release announcing my appointment, the OAS itself cannot remain silent and become another international bystander to past and ongoing mass atrocities. And if existing international mechanisms are not responding to the demands and needs of victims on mass atrocities in the Americas, at the very least, the OAS should try to design and build a regional mechanism that can prevent and respond more efficiently and in a timely manner to crimes of this nature in the Western Hemisphere. When working through what kinds of actions that might be undertaken by the OAS and its various organizations and entities as part of a potential new regional R2P system, it will be critical for me to engage in a wide array of consultations. My work as the special advisor will begin with my analyzing, studying, and discussing how to develop a mechanism for the OAS to prevent and respond to mass atrocity crimes in the region with all interested parties, and as a consequence, formulating suggested possible courses of action by the organization. In the coming weeks, I'll be seeking individual consultations with all OAS member states, focal points on R2P from OAS member states, and all relevant international organizations, civil society groups, think tanks, and other experts, some of whom are, of course, on this call today. Now let me turn to the specific situation of Venezuela. It's been widely documented by international organizations and civil society groups that crimes against humanity are being committed by the Maduro regime against the people of Venezuela. Importantly, in relation to my new role, this conclusion was already reached specifically by the OAS commissioned panel of international independent experts who published their excellent report in 2018. And it's great to see Erwin Kotler, who of course was one of the commissioners of the report, on the call today. In light of the panel's conclusions and by the plain language of paragraphs 138 to 140 of the 2005 World Summit Outcome document, and as indeed Delsa talked about much more extensively, it's clear the Majuro regime has failed in its responsibility to protect its populations from mass atrocity crimes, as it has been the author of crimes against humanity, including those specific crimes of murder, torture, imprisonment, enforced disappearance, rape and sexual violence, persecution, and other inhumane acts inflicting great suffering or death. But having established that R2P applies to the situation in Venezuela, however, the most important question is what next? Under paragraph 138, it says that the international community should, as appropriate, encourage and help states to exercise this responsibility. And under paragraph 139, the international community has a responsibility to use appropriate means through the UN to help protect populations suffering from mass atrocity crimes. In my view, the OAS has an important role to play in encouraging, supporting, and facilitating actions under these two possible approaches to addressing mass atrocity crimes in Venezuela. In fact, prior to being appointed special advisor, I had previously been commissioned by the Secretary General to complete an update to the 2018 OAS panel report. This report is in fact already complete, and I expect to launch the report in November. That report will reaffirm in enormous detail not only the scale and the scope of the crimes being committed by the Maduro regime, but also how they qualify as crimes against humanity. And the report will make specific recommendations about how to achieve justice and accountability for these crimes. At the same time, however, there is also an urgent need to help protect the people of Venezuela from the ongoing mass atrocity crimes that they are suffering. At this early stage of my work, and prior to my having engaged in wide consultations, I'm not in a position to provide specific details of what I will propose next. But what I can say is that I understand and appreciate the urgency, and that I'll work as quickly as I can to understand the wide array of views that I'll be presented with, and will propose further action that draws on the strengths of the OAS and is consistent with the obligation of all states under R2P. Let me just conclude with the words of Secretary General Luis Almagro, who has been unequivocal in his advocacy to address the crisis in Venezuela. He recently said, quote, "Going back to our founding, the OAS has sought to secure peace, justice, and human rights for the people of the Americas. Yet over time, there has been mass atrocities committed in far too many countries by repressive and undemocratic regimes. One need no further to look no further than the crimes against humanity being committed today," and he's of course spoken about Venezuela in detail, "which come from a deliberate, methodical, and systematic strategy to understand the consequences of our failure to act together. I look forward to helping establish a regional R2P system for the OAS in the Americas, and of course to assisting and creating even greater energy and actions to apply R2P to the situation in Venezuela specifically. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jerry Jensen, for your exposition. And listen, by the way, the first person that I'm here talking about R2P so openly and directly was Luis Almagro. And that happened many years ago. So what is important of this kind of webinar event? What is important of this kind of discussion? The important thing is that on a diplomatic basis, R2P is no longer a taboo. It's no longer an issue that it's no longer an issue that is prohibited to talk openly, and in that case, in the Venezuelan case, because it's so eloquent, it's so serious what happened in Venezuela. When Kofi Annan just delegated to Canadian diplomacy and a deep study about R2P during 5 years, he always saying, wow, if we apply that doctrine and principle at a time that we have to, for sure we avoid a genocide in Rwanda. It's not a speculation to say that the application of R2P is a modern way to defend human rights in the 10th century, 21st, and it's a way to avoid and prevent maybe a social explosion in Venezuela. So we cannot apply R2P after everything happened. We need to think seriously to appeal to responsibility to protect, as I dared say, in order to prevent more suffering, torture, crimes, mafias. It's so many in one country, in one state. And as Delsa has appointed, which is very important, and who commit that crime? Who is responsible of that crime? The government of Venezuela, the regime of Venezuela. He is responsible. So that creates the condition to say that they deserve to be appointed as a legitimate representative of the state of Venezuela. So now that we already conclude with the intervention of our panelists, I just want to take advantage of my hosting to put two rapidly questions, mostly between Vanessa, Bill, Irving Kotler. The first one is in relation, will UK be able to sanction Venezuelan associate corrupts and human rights violators? What is UK timeline in that direction? First question, okay? Whether or not we can try to find, Vanessa, a universal jurisdiction in United Kingdom. And secondly, Mr. Kotler, can Canada and Europe use their courts against human rights violation from Venezuela? What conditions of victims and violators should be considered in order to find out the way to active universal jurisdiction in Canada? Ladies first, so please, Vanessa, go ahead, and then maybe Mr. Bill Brodlett, and then Irving Kotler. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Orlando. I thought we were friends. What is this knack of yours for putting me in the hot seat? Listen, yeah, so basically the timeline for the United Kingdom is, as you know, takes great pride in being sort of, first of all, the UK Parliament considers itself the mother of all parliaments, right? There was a time when the United Kingdom basically exported, in the British Empire at its height, exported its concept of rule of law and human rights to 2/3 of the planet. So the influence of the UK courts and the UK Parliament cannot be underestimated. And it considers it part of its national DNA to be a leader in things like the rule of law and human rights and separation of powers, etc. And that has been a cornerstone of my work with them and my engagement with them as they have supported the Guaido administration and along various initiatives. However, as you know, they have always had a fraught relationship with the European Union, even from the days of Margaret Thatcher, and that still continues, and they are in the process of Brexiting. So the British politicians will tell you they have Brexited, the EU and businesses will tell you they have not yet Brexited. So basically, we're looking at a timeline for more independent sanctions regime to really kick in January 2021, when they will be free of the European Union limitations, where they need to rule by consensus. In other words, the UK will be free to pass its own laws and its own sanctions regime. That having been said, I know for a fact, because we've discussed it in meetings, that they have transposed all of the European sanctions that they have approved into the UK framework. What we're looking for, and Bill Browder will know better than I will even on this, is for them to apply Magnitsky sanctions to Venezuelan leaders. I personally would like to see them applied not just to the Padrino Lopez types and the commanders who have so much money within Europe, and we're looking into what assets are within the UK. I cannot discuss that obviously publicly, but that is certainly work that is ongoing. And what would be those targets and those individuals? There's an argument to be made that also, as the excellent work that Bill Browder has done with Magnitsky, that some of the, for instance, judges, there's Carol Padilla, who has, been involved with the Juan Requesens case, with the cases even of going after issuing the orders of us, and also military prisoners. So those judges who serve the interests of the corruption, the torture, and the human rights should also, I would like to also be included in Magnitsky. But we need that stronger emphasis on kleptocracy and corruption, that those who commit human rights abuses in order to steal or cause human rights abuses by their stealing should really be sanctioned under a strong UK regime of sanctions. Now, also, Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab has told me that that is what he intends to do, and I promise you I will be holding him to it, as I'm sure Bill Browder will as well. Thank you.
Go ahead, Bill, please.
Need to unmute. Okay, here we are. I don't think it's a heavy lift in the UK to get the British government to apply Magnitsky sanctions to officials in the Maduro regime. Venezuela doesn't have the any type of leverage over the British government. There's no trade to worry about. There's no political fallout from the sanctions. And most importantly, Britain's two big allies in this area, the United States and Canada, have already created a sanctions list. I would say the main barrier to getting the British government to apply Magnitsky sanctions is just the incredible flood of human rights abuses that are going on around the world. You've got Belarus, you've got China, you've got Iran, you've got Russia with poisonings and so on. And so it's just so hard for anyone to focus in government on one situation because there's just so many situations. And so what I would argue is that in a situation like this, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. It's really important that individuals, Vanessa and others, are there constantly in Parliament and in front of the government with the evidence of these abuses, so that that the priority on Venezuela rises up, because there's just so many other things going on. But this is not a heavy lift. This is not an unlikely outcome. I think it's very likely to happen. It's just purely a question of bandwidth, attention span, and what else is going on. And just to finish up, as Vanessa mentioned, Britain is going through Brexit, and so Brexit and COVID, I should say. And so there's a lot of other things that are on everybody's mind, and so even more of a challenge to get the politicians to pay attention. But if they do pay attention, it's a pretty easy sell.
Thank you, Mr. Browder. Mr. Kotler, the application of universal jurisdiction in Canada, how do you see it? Go ahead. Now.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, on a matter of universal jurisdiction, Canada has a War Crimes and Crimes Against Humanity Act, which mandates the use of universal jurisdiction regime. I was one of the members of Parliament who co-sponsored the adoption of that act in 2000. It was related also to the adoption of the Rome ICC statute. And when I was Minister of Justice, I prosecuted the first ever crime against humanity and the genocide under that statute with regard to a Rwandan war criminal. And the courts in Canada found him to be guilty of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and indeed even genocide. Regrettably, that remains almost the only case in which the universal jurisdiction regime, which exists, has in fact been utilized. The war crimes section in the Department of Justice in Canada is under resourced, but in fact the needs have grown greater, and we are giving effectively immunity and impunity to war criminals from many jurisdictions where in Canada by our non-prosecution. So the regime is there, but it is not being implemented. That's number one. With regard to Europe, there are countries in Europe that do have a universal jurisdiction regime. Those countries can certainly exercise that regime. I also mentioned that countries like the Netherlands, have joined the Gambia in that regard. So we have a situation where European countries can enter this. But I just want to close with one important point, because it may not be fully appreciated, and that is the extent of the assault on the rule of law in Venezuela, the assault on the independence of the judiciary, the assault on the integrity of law enforcement. In a word, what we have in Venezuela has been most expertly discussed by the guest, is not only a culture of criminality and a culture of corruption, but a culture of impunity that underpins it. A good case study, and a dramatic one, which revealed itself before our public hearings of our Commission of Inquiry into Crimes Against Humanity in Venezuela, was a case of Leopoldo Lopez, a judge from Venezuela who had escaped to Canada. Judge Renata Tovar testified that she was forced, on pain of herself being imprisoned or tortured, to issue a false arrest warrant against Leopoldo Lopez. Franklin Neves, the prosecutor who also escaped, testified before a Commission of Inquiry to say that he was ordered to issue false and trumped up charges against Leopoldo Lopez, again on pain of imprisonment. And we had also testimony of those who were coerced into making false accusations with respect to Leopoldo Lopez. So what we're seeing, and that's just one looking glass into the vast culture of corruption and criminality and impunity in Venezuela, which makes and mandates the use of universal jurisdiction regimes in Canada and in Europe, so necessary at this point if we're to secure justice for the victims and accountability for the violators.
Thank you, Professor Kotler. And that allowed to me to try to make a link, a bridge with Jared. Jared, today, by the way, in the middle of OAS, R2P is part of the agenda. We already got so many statements from Brazil, from Colombia, from Costa Rica, that in some way talking about the serious situation that we confront in the region because of Venezuelan situation. How do you envision the possibility to create a new alliance against in the frames of TR, for example, which is has been very slow trying to promote a coalition in order to defend the Venezuelan situation and defend Venezuelan people in the diaspora. Please, Jer.
Well, thanks for the question, Orlando. I mean, I think, again, it's early days for me. I've literally been in this position for less than 2 weeks. I'll begin with an observation, however, that really the application of R2P to Venezuela within the OAS has been really, up to this stage, exclusively by the Secretary General and the General Secretariat of the OAS. And so while on the one hand, of course, we've seen actions undertaken by the General Assembly and the Permanent Council relating to Venezuela specifically, it has not actually discussed or applied R2P to the situation in Venezuela yet. It has been speaking more broadly about the political crisis, the lack of democracy, the recognition, obviously, of the Guaido government, et cetera. And so this is why really my mandate is on building an R2P system more broadly. And that is really going to be where I'm going to have to focus a great deal of effort in consulting with member states to see what might be possible through the political bodies of the OAS. But obviously there's the Inter-American Commission and Court of the OAS and a range of other bodies that could potentially engage on these kinds of questions. And so I'm going to have to be talking to a whole lot of people to get a sense of what might be possible in terms of building the system. At the same time, of course, I'm deeply concerned about the ongoing Commission of Crimes Against Humanity in Venezuela, and the situation in Venezuela can't wait until a system is built in order to start talking about and taking more robust efforts to apply R2P to the situation there. And so my efforts on Venezuela will be in parallel with my efforts to help build the broader system. But I would say that although the Secretary General himself has been an extraordinary champion regarding not only addressing the crisis in Venezuela, but the crimes against humanity there by having commissioned the panel report and hosted a conference on R2P as it applies to Venezuela, et cetera. I wouldn't overstate what the OAS has done up until this point in terms of R2P. An enormous amount of additional work, in my view, needs to be done. And one piece of that additional work, honestly, is going to be to help ensure that people understand what R2P actually means and how it is applied, and the wide array of options available to individual member states, regional organizations, and the UN when deciding how to engage with specific country situations on both the prevention side, but also on the timely and decisive response side of the equation. And I think that especially in the Latin American region, there's been, I think, a lot of misperceptions about what R2P is and how it might apply in any given case. And so, part of what I'll also be doing, undoubtedly in the coming months, is also working on another report beyond the Venezuela report that I'll be starting with, that will be on the broader R2P definition and application and what it might mean, and examining a whole wide array in which the OAS can engage on R2P situations, and what are the options that are available, not only to member states, but also to the OAS's regional body to apply R2P to country specific situations. But as I said, I've been in the role for only less than 2 weeks. I have a whole lot of people to talk to. I think the reality is, although R2P, as mandated in the 2005 World Summit Outcome Document, is quite clear about what situations qualify to apply R2P to, and given the crimes against humanity in Venezuela, undoubtedly it applies to the situation there. What is also quite clear is that one can only move forward action to apply R2P to particular situations if you can build support for doing so. And I think that unfortunately, we have been unable to, until this stage, to really get the UN itself to engage on these questions. And I think it's going to be very, very important for member states of the OAS and for the OAS itself to be pressing not only for actions from within the OAS system in all possible ways, but also for the OAS more broadly, not just the Secretary General or myself, to be pressing Secretary General Guterres to be encouraging and supporting the work of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, and to emphasize that it needs to go further to support the independent inquiry. And there are a whole wide array of efforts, I think, that need to be undertaken in that regard. So again, there's a lot to work on and to go through. As I said, I understand the urgency of the crisis, undoubtedly, having independently worked on the situation of Venezuela myself going back to 2014. And so, there'll be a lot of work ahead, to broaden an appreciation for what R2P means and how it should be applied by OAS member states, to determine the ways in which the OAS as an institution beyond the Secretary General can be employed to put to good use to apply R2P, and then to figure out the most effective ways in which the OAS itself can engage with the UN and other international actors to press forward. Lastly, I'll just say on that Erwin earlier spoke a lot about the ICC and the need for the ICC to engage. And the report that we're putting forward, that I'll be putting forward on crimes against humanity, will also look at those kinds of issues and questions, and about the substantial and really unexplained and inexplicable delays of the International Criminal Court in simply moving from where it is now, which is a preliminary examination, to a full investigation into the crimes against humanity going on in Venezuela. So again, there's a lot more for us to discuss, and this is a relatively brief discussion here, but I can assure you that I'll be very much fully engaged in ensuring that we do everything possible to ensure that R2P is applied to Venezuela in as many ways as we can develop and in as many creative ways as we can come up with.
Thank you, Jer, for your explanation. I have one more reflection and one more question for Delsa. My reflection is that that's the thing, Jer. We already have the whole condition in order to apply R2P for sure. The point is the political will, the international political will in order to proceed this, and that is part of our work. Try to find, finally, the political will to understand that the only way maybe that we already have in order to try to push the finalization of the regime is some kind of intervention of the international community, furthermore of maybe rhetoric, or furthermore even another kind of diplomacy. So Delsa, it's an important point that I want to share with the audience. Es un importante tema que nos preocupa a los venezolanos en general, les debe preocupar a ustedes como diputados de Venezuela, y es el tema de la continuidad de la Asamblea Nacional como el último vestigio de legitimidad, el último vestigio de poder legítimo que tiene Venezuela. Cuando uno habla de R2P, cuando uno hace este tipo de reflexiones, está hablando de todo el listado de sufrimiento, de atropellos, de crímenes contra la humanidad, y está hablando también el mundo de cómo el régimen intenta quedarse, como decía Vanessa, con corrupción, con lavado de dinero, con organizaciones y mafias, pero también con elecciones fraudulentas. It's important to put it in agenda. The fraud election in Venezuela is not just about to say it's going to be a fraud election in Venezuela. It's in order to understand the continuation of the legitimacy of the National Assembly and the interim government of Juan Guaidó. Because it's the only and the last chain of legitimacy to struggle and to fight against the regime. So, ¿cómo lo ves tú? ¿Cómo se está, digamos, de alguna manera convocando a lo interno y a lo externo un consenso para ese entendimiento? Because one of the conditions in order to understand the continuation of the assembly is the recognition of the third states. And that is part of our work. Sí. So, please, Delsa.
A ver, en primer lugar, yo quisiera decir que esto no es un tema de carácter personal. Y creo que es importante porque de algún modo tú lo asomas en tu introducción. Esto no se trata de proteger a Juan Guaidó como individuo, como persona o como dirigente. No se trata de proteger a Delsa, perdón que hable de mí en primera persona, o a las personas que integran el gobierno interino o a los diputados en tanto que. Siempre lo digo, yo no nací de diputada, yo nací venezolana. Político sí, diputado no. Es decir, para nosotros el ejercicio de estos cargos ha sido una cosa instrumental. ¿Sí? Nosotros somos un instrumento para la democracia, para alcanzar la democracia en el país. Y desde el mismo momento en que resultamos electos, comenzó la persecución o se incrementó, porque algunos de nosotros ya habíamos sido víctimas, ya tenemos muchos años siendo víctimas de persecución, pero la persecución institucional comenzó desde el mismo momento de la elección, incluso antes de la juramentación, cuando vimos una Asamblea Nacional saliente que ante el hecho cierto de haber perdido la elección, se eligieron a sí mismos y votaron por sí mismos para resultar magistrados del Tribunal Supremo de Justicia, un acto absolutamente ilegal, y con ello pues poder anular el nombramiento o la elección, corrijo, de algunos parlamentarios, en particular de los representantes de nuestros pueblos originarios, de nuestros hermanos indígenas, y de ahí para adelante ha venido un centenar de sentencias, todas ilegales, en contra de la Asamblea Nacional. Señalo esto, Orlando, porque reitero que desde diciembre de 2015 para acá, Solamente hemos visto a un régimen que ha pretendido acabar con la Asamblea Nacional porque este cuerpo cuenta con una legitimidad de origen muy poderosa. Nosotros fuimos electos por una mayoría abrumadora de la población. 2/3 de la representación de la Asamblea Nacional, lo cual obviamente tiene relación o vinculación directa con la votación que obtuvimos. Hay diputados, como mi caso, yo estoy electa por el 87% de los votos de mi circuito, en un circuito donde en 18 años nunca había ganado la oposición, ¿no? Entonces tenemos una legitimidad de origen muy poderosa, tanto en cuanto a los votos como en cuanto a la constitucionalidad de nuestra elección. Ante el hecho de que el régimen no pudo doblegarnos, ha hecho diversos intentos de acabar con la Asamblea porque, repito, somos el único vestigio, el único instrumento real para poder alcanzar la democracia como institución. Primero, trató con diversas sentencias de anularnos, luego fraudulentamente instaló la mal llamada Asamblea Nacional Constituyente, y yo me quiero referir a un hecho posterior que se inició a mediados del año pasado y que tuvo su clímax en principio de y me refiero a la llamada Operación Alacrán, coloquialmente en Venezuela llamada así, que no fue más que un mecanismo a través del cual compraron conciencias, porque lamentablemente hay gente que tiene conciencia que se vende, y pretendieron a través de mecanismos de corrupción comprar diputados de oposición, y no pudieron sino con 8 nomás. Solamente 8 parlamentarios se vendieron al régimen y hoy representan al régimen, y luego, como no obtuvieron la mayoría, así tampoco, tomaron violentamente el Palacio Federal Legislativo el 5 de enero, y luego vino una sentencia que absurdamente, sin votos ni ningún tipo de sustento legal, designa a Luis Parra, a uno de estos cómplices del régimen, como presidente de la Asamblea Nacional, en otro intento de acabar con la Asamblea. No pudieron, porque ni los diputados nos hemos rendido, por supuesto con Guaidó a la cabeza, ni mucho menos la comunidad internacional les ha comprado esa estafa que pretenden vender. Pero entonces, al no poder hacer eso, ¿cuál es el siguiente paso? El siguiente paso es armar un fraude electoral para decirle al mundo que en Venezuela hubo una elección y que nuestro periodo se venció y en consecuencia ya no somos parlamentarios. Pues eso tampoco es cierto. La realidad es que mientras no haya una elección, y esto tiene que quedar muy claro, lo que va a ocurrir en mi país el 6 de diciembre o cuando sea, porque para nosotros el problema no está en la fecha, sino en el mecanismo. Lo que va a ocurrir en mi país, en principio, el 6 de diciembre no es una elección, es un fraude, tal cual ocurrió en mayo de 2018, cuando se hizo el fraude presidencial que sostuvo a Maduro en el poder. Más de 60 países dijeron que eso no era una elección, sino un fraude, una trampa. Es lo mismo que va a ocurrir acá en diciembre con los diputados. Entonces, ¿qué establece la Constitución venezolana? ¿Y qué ha establecido a lo largo de todos estos años, a través de distintas sentencias, el Tribunal Supremo de Justicia? Se establece el mecanismo de la continuidad constitucional. Ahí repito, distintas sentencias del Tribunal Supremo que sientan estas bases, que señalan que ante hechos donde no se puede hacer una elección por cualquier circunstancia, continúa el poder existente o los funcionarios existentes hasta que se pueda hacer una elección, porque dando base a la teoría del órgano, usted no puede dejar el órgano vacío. Entonces, lo que corresponde, claro, lo que corresponde en derecho es que continúe la Asamblea Nacional hasta que se pueda hacer una elección. Nosotros no tenemos ningún interés en quedarnos en esos cargos. Nosotros tenemos interés en la libertad de Venezuela. Evidentemente, aquí la elección que está vencida es la presidencial, y por ello, parte de nuestra lucha hoy es que podamos hacer elecciones presidenciales y parlamentarias libres, donde en efecto un ciudadano pueda ir a votar con un Consejo Nacional Electoral o un ente rector electoral electo como corresponde. A nosotros nos quitaron la posibilidad de hacerlo porque Maduro, a través de sus abogados en el TSJ, en el Tribunal Supremo, escogió un CNE cooptado, porque además se robaron nuestros partidos políticos. Orlando, ojalá que el mundo entienda que si nosotros quisiéramos ser candidatos mañana, no podemos hacerlo, porque no tenemos partidos. Nos los robaron todos.
The party has been confiscated, right?
Así es, o sea, no solamente los partidos políticos tradicionales, como el caso de Acción Democrática, que es un partido de 79 años, antes se habían robado el Partido Social Cristiano COPEI, pero partidos nuevos como el mío, como Encuentro Ciudadano, que ya estábamos legalizados ante el Consejo Nacional Electoral, nos quitaron la posibilidad de inscribirnos y no nos dieron la tarjeta, la autorización final, cuando dijimos que no íbamos a participar en el fraude, o partidos como Voluntad Popular, al cual también le arrebataron su tarjeta electoral, o Primera Justicia. Entonces, ni siquiera en el caso de que nosotros decidiéramos participar, podríamos hacerlo, porque en efecto, el régimen lo que pretende es acabar con la Asamblea Nacional. De tal manera que en mi criterio, tanto jurídico como político, lo que corresponde en derecho es justamente la continuidad constitucional de la Asamblea Nacional.
Thank you, Delsa. Thank you very much. Gracias, Delsa. So now I would like to give to get into some Q&A. I already have here Fernando Fernandez. He wants to make an intervention. So Álvaro, please, Dr. Fernando Fernández con su pregunta. Creo que tienen que quitarle el mute a Fernando. Fernando, adelante.
Tiene quitado.
Adelante, adelante. Adelante, Fernando. Lamentablemente, por alguna razón no se está escuchando, aun cuando no está mute, no se te está escuchando tu pregunta.
No escuchamos.
Ok, pasemos a otro, no podemos resolver esto ahorita.
Ok. Tenía también pendiente, creo que Milos Alcalá. Y Milos, por favor, adelante. Parece que tenemos problemas con los audios. Fernando no pudo finalmente, digamos, escucharse, ¿no? Fernando, déjame...
Intentemos por última vez con Fernando.
Intentemos con Fernando. Fernando, intenta nuevamente para ver si te escuchamos.
No es un problema, digamos, de este lado, ¿ok?
Sí, es un problema de origen.
Ok, bueno, yo creo que entonces ya podemos ir cerrando, señor embajador.
Sí, well, I would like to thanks again I feel very honored, very grateful, very proud, very happy for the whole intervention of any one of the panelists today. My last reflection is that we are in presence of what I call the Somalization, the Africanization of the conflict in South America, in America. It's not an easy issue. It's a huge challenge trying to stop many things on the criminal basis what are happening in Venezuela. We can see in the face, in the nose of the world, how Iran go to Venezuela. And that do not mean something simple. That is a criminal organization, it's the radicalization of the conflict in our country through our terrorist groups. R2P is true, it's a principle, it's a doctrine, it's not a rule. But on the moral basis and in the frame of the main objective of the international public order, which is the justice, R2P maybe could be one of the tools, the main tool to try to finally looking for a solution in Venezuela. Justice is freedom. So we have to move forward in that direction. R2P is not just about intervention, military intervention. It's many aspects. It's, as the panelists I'm saying today, it's about universal jurisdiction. It's about sanction. It's about the coordination, the cooperation of the international community in order to get pressure and squeeze the regime in order to finally to defeat and step down Maduro and the whole mafia that we have in Venezuela. For me, it's so painful to see how our children, our women in pregnancy, trying to go to another country, try to swim just to save the life of their son. To see how our people, just as the President Guaido have said, just gain $2 a month. $2, which means that in order to obtain the basic food in a month, you have to work in Venezuela 15 years. 15 years to pay the equivalent to buy a basicness of food in Venezuela. So thank you very much to Ambassador Vanessa Neumann. Thank you very much, dear Delsa Solórzano, Mr. Irving Kotler, Jared. Thank you very much, Bill Golder, for your intervention today, because it is the way, that's the path. In order to convince and to obtain the political will to the world that in Venezuela what happened is no exaggeration to say we need to prevent, responsibility to prevent, responsibility to restitution and restoration, responsibility to protect our people. Finally, I would like to thank my team, Álvaro, my chief of staff, Álvaro Briceño, Jessica, our translator, Jessica Old. I would like to thank also Sergio and Edgardo and Manuela Bendaño, who coordinate with the presidents the whole agenda today. And I would like to thank finally the president, our president Juan Guaido, who is so brave, is a leader that facing Venezuela in a very, very unequal situation, a fight against a regime that had not any kind of measure to proceed with crimes and tortures and anything. Thank you, President, not just to be the interim president of Venezuela. Thank you, President, to confront, for facing a very terrible situation. And thank you also all the Venezuelan people that trying to survive and the leader that try to survive this terrible situation that we live. I hope that later than we could have, sooner than later, we could have a final solution for Venezuela. So thank you for all the Venezuelan, all the audience that we got today. And I hope to see you soon, but in freedom as we deserve in our country. Good afternoon, and thank you very much.